Samson Williams. And Samson Williams and George Pullen are both professors. Hey, I'll let them do a little more about the details of what they do. But today we're gonna have a great talk about the space economy and blockchain and how it's related. And just really excited to finally hear these guys. I'll talk first at FedEx Institute of Technology. And recently too, the IEEE Blockchain Initiatives also joined as a technical partner in this series too. So we'll start getting them a little more involved. I know we had a few speakers last year from IEEE, so it was great. And I think we're still waiting for George to get connected, I think, or is he out there and I can't see him? Hey, and there's Judith from Working FinTech, the real Judith.
Hello. Why does Michael have my name on his thing?
Yeah, I think it's probably the Zoom link. If
Yeah, it's
That's gotta be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I have a couple.
Oh,
Students
okay.
that have my name, so
That's so funny. I
No
didn't
problem.
even notice that. Good catch, though, Judith. Let me see if I can fix that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I turned that function on.
I'm Michael Hernandez, by the way. I'm not Judith.
I invited him.
like, well, the real Judith shouldn't be good.
Yeah, yeah, by all means, please. Please feel free to rename yourselves, yes. And this will be
Please
recorded.
rename yourselves.
Yeah. Our session is being
Thank you.
recorded, so all this fun stuff will be on the recording. It'll be posted on our FIT Blockchain901 joint website. So
Yeah, it'll get posted. We could probably be short in the beginning if we need to, but
Yeah. Well, while we're waiting on George, I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Crumbly over there and joining us from the University of Tuskegee in Alabama.
I appreciate you. We got to catch up, so hopefully we can do that sooner than later.
100%. You're looking sharp today. I
Thank
got
you,
dressed
sir.
up for everyone. I wear
Thank you,
my
sir.
yeah.
Man, I like your hair, man. It's there today.
I was telling Christina I was getting all dressed up. I think George is joining us shortly. He said he's logging in. He apologizes profusely. They run on a different time in low Earth orbit. And while we're waiting on George, Judith, how are you doing today? How's folks at Morning State?
Doing well, thank you.
I'm loving this Sunday morning sun behind you on your left over your left shoulder.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn that into an NFT. Okay, we're doing a workshop in March with the Hyperledger Foundation, and they're going to show me how to turn my original piece of artwork into an NFT.
Okay, good luck selling
I don't know how
it.
to do that, but I will.
and George is all dressed up. Fancy.
George called me from the White House this morning. And he was doing something, and I was like, George, you probably shouldn't be talking about this on the phone. He's like, oh, never mind, wrong number. Click, and he hung up on me.
So it was something sort of like that, but well, I'm not going to get into it, but anyway, it was something sort of like that. But I made it.
Go share with us.
I made it back, so I'm here now. No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm here now. I made it back to my favorite place in the world, which is of course my house. But yeah, I was in downtown today. And of course, I decided to fix potholes in the GW Parkway, or else I would have been 3 months late. And I apologize to everyone. It's not like me to be tardy at all, but I'm very sorry about that.
You have a slight lag in your speech, George, but that's okay. In your video, rather, not your speech. But you know, you've got that face for radio, so we'll be okay.
Oh,
that's so nice of you.
I just want to thank you guys. I've been really excited and that you accepted my offer to come and speak, because I think you guys are very entertaining and you're the perfect guys to get everyone interested in space and blockchain. Can't think of anybody better to do it.
Excellent, excellent. We do actually have a slideshow to show you. It's only 2 slides, so it's not super big. We don't even actually need them if you don't want them. I'm just letting you know we do have a slideshow if you want to be wowed by our 2 slides.
No, maybe, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Dr. Crumley just gave us a thumbs up.
Yep, he gave a thumbs up. I think we'll let
Yeah,
Dr. Crumbly vote on that.
I would love to see it.
Okay, and I'm gonna get out of my video.
Cool.
And can you guys take over the screen, okay, for the screen share?
I think so.
There you go. Oh, right, good.
Boom.
There's no telling what happens next.
Excellent. We actually skipped the first slide, which just says we're going to talk about the space economy. And ta-da, we are at here, the space economy. I'm going to get a prop right quick. Here we go. This is our very expensive rocket economy. And so we're going to talk about the space economy. And I actually let George, since he's wearing a tie today, he's going to talk you through some of the numbers. And we're going to, and if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand or just yell out. And we're happy to answer your questions in real time. George, the mic is yours.
All right. I hope there's not a delay anymore.
Nope, you're synced
Never
up.
good.
Yeah, I reset my link. All right. So today, the space economy is worth $485 billion. Now, $485 billion used to mean something, but now that everyone talks in trillions, we can just skip that. Today's number, we'll just move straight to the forecast. So the common forecasted number is $4 trillion by the 2040s. And according to the Chinese Space Agency, it'll be 10 trillion. So if you sort of anchor your thinking in between that 4 trillion and $10 trillion marks, you have a good idea of the size of the economy we're talking about developing over time. Let's also put this in perspective, because sometimes economists do a terrible job of talking in billions and trillions, and they're all flippant about it. I'm not going to do that with you. $1 trillion is, well, let's start there, is a lot of money. But 4 trillion to 10 trillion, however, to contextualize that, is the equivalent of an entire continent's worth of economic activity. So today, Australia, Africa, South America are all continents that have economic activity below that $4 to $10 trillion number. So if you're thinking about a cislunar economy, cislunar means here to the moon, a cislunar economy worth $4 to $10 trillion by the 2040s, you're talking about an entire continent's worth of economic activity over our heads. The key thing here is that we don't want it over our heads. We'd like a little bit of that in all of our pockets. And so that's going to be the next piece of this. Samson, I'll go to you for the relay race.
Okay, cool. I did actually want to go back because me and George tell ourselves this all the time. We often talk to each other in vacuum. And so it's like, oh, we don't want to do that. So I wanted everyone to be clear that every day you interact with the space economy. This Zoom meeting is probably being facilitated by the space economy. If you have a smartphone, a GPS in your car, if you go to the grocery store, you are interacting with the space economy. Many people will say, I've never been to space. I will challenge anyone. Have you ever actually been on the internet? No, but you use it every day. And so this is where sometimes we forget to let people know that the space economy is integral to their life as the internet, as modern day finance. And so it's not some obtuse thing that exists in the ether. We use it every day, regardless of what our business happens to be. Sometimes we forget to say that. And also to give you some context, in January 2020, the space economy is worth $485 billion. What you don't know is when we first started, when George was trying to convince me of the space economy, I was like, George, go away. This doesn't exist. When he first started to convince me of this, the space economy was worth about $400 billion. That was in early 2020, before the pandemic. And of course, nothing really exists before then. But part of the reason that it's now gone from 400 billion to 485 billion, a little bit of that is inflation, but part of it is also the commercialization of space. Excluding the billion to go on trips, there's commercial activity in the space economy. And George, if you can, let's talk a little bit about the difference between the space economy and industry. I'm going to pitch that to you. Go for it.
Sure. So when we talk about an industry, we are talking about a set of firms that are providing goods and services to each other. Okay, that is an industry. That industry usually could be very specifically broken down into, we have a media industry. Okay, we have a food industry, we have a car industry. So these are all industries that produce a very certain thing. They rely on their partners to provide them composite goods, materials, and services, and they form an industry together. The difference, however, between an industry and economy is the economy gives you your second layer, your second order effects. So an economy is the network of activities and the interconnection of all of those previously mentioned industry participants into a much larger ecosystem that also includes the workers, the beneficiaries, the IP, the technology, and et cetera, that comes out of those industries. So a great example is people who are engaged with selling goods online, right? They're selling goods online. They are part of a larger economy that is made possible because of the internet. So they're part of the internet economy. Now, no one says internet economy. That makes you sound foolish if you say internet economy, but they're part of the internet economy. So I just said it, now it's on tape, I said internet economy. So you're part of the internet economy if you're selling things online, but really you're also a part of the industry, which is that thing, that widget that you're making. All right. So think of the economy again as being that larger network of activities that are enabled and they're connected through those firms that make up the industry. That's an important distinction, because right now the space industry has some very large household names, and maybe some others that you haven't heard of, that make it up. But the difference between today's space industry and tomorrow's space economy is the way that those connections lead other industries to be able to participate, other goods, products, and services to be able to be sold, other members to be able to participate through their labors. So I just wanted to make sure we're clear here. Industry, economy, they're not the same thing. Sometimes you hear people use them interchangeably. As an economist, that bothers me. They should not. So these are two distinct items.
And also there are influencers in the space economy. If you're on Twitter, one of them is right now manipulating the price of Doge, promising to eat McDonald's if McDonald's accepts Doge. And so with that context in mind, the difference between the space industry and the space economy, as George said, it's very similar to the difference between the internet economy and just the overall economy. You sound stupid if you say the internet economy, because it's so ingrained with the economy as a whole, we would never think to bifurcate it. However, all the trillion-dollar businesses, they're part of the internet economy. In the future, the quadrillion-dollar businesses will be part of the space economy. But again, we won't bifurcate the two. Some economists might, but generally speaking, we'll just say the economy or what's happening in space. Where this brings us is to the International Space Race 2.0. Space is a very collaborative place because space has a lot of room for everyone. This is actually a conversation about geopolitics. Because if we look at just geopolitics right now, what's happening in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, what's happening in APAC, Asia Pacific, with China and Taiwan, this is the same geopolitics, except it's 62 miles up. And so if you look at what China's planning for the moon, if you look how geopolitics on the ground are being taken into space and then eventually outer space, cislunar space, you see that China and Russia and their allies, they're making alliances to determine what's going to happen for the development of space. There is a very strong argument that in the coming decades, it will be more important to speak standard Mandarin in space than English. And so that's sort of like a big deal, because if you think about it, a terrestrial version of this, airline pilots, they all have to speak English. Why? It's just required because America led the way on that. So it does matter who gets there first and who stays and develops not only the moon, but other locations in space and outer space. We also should mention JAXA, the Japanese space agencies. We should mention what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is doing in space by partnering with Russia and China, how the United Arab Emirates and JAXA, they have their own mission to send a satellite to Mars in late 2020. And so it's definitely a space race. It's no longer an individual country who's trying to get to space first, develop space. It's 100% collaborative. And it's just very interesting who is collaborating with whom. And I would like to mention before I forget, because I always forget this, we focus on America, China, Russia, but don't disregard the smaller countries. United Arab Emirates, Nigeria is not small, but when you think about it from its position on the world stage, they're going to benefit from the last 60 years of technology development. They don't have to discover how a rocket works. They can actually go to, Blue Shift or Orbit's Edge and rent a nanosat, rent space on a nanosat rocket to actually help them get into space and do the business of space. So even if you're a small country, Mauritius, they're on the southeast side of Africa, they're a small country, but because they don't have to build the infrastructure, they can literally call in the Uber of space, a nanosat, or hitch a ride with someone else. The smaller countries have such a strategic advantage in getting to space and setting up their own space businesses and establishing their presence in space. So I should pause to see something in the chat. Maybe it's a question. Does anyone have a question or a comment so far? Going once, going twice. Excellent. I'm wowing you with our brilliance, George. It must be the tie you're wearing today.
It must be the tie. It's my official capital tie. So.
Really?
No, it really is. It's
okay, I see that. I see that. George has like
Yeah.
two ties, so it's amazing.
Yeah, the other one has Monopoly stuff on it, so it's great. I see a question in the chat. The summary is, what business models can support the high revenue necessary for space business? A case for asteroid mining. Okay, so
let's answer that question in the sense of talking about the major components.
Oh, okay.
Okay, is there another question? Yeah, is there another question?
There's a second one there about robots. It's not really
we like robots. Question. So let me tell you about upstream first, using my super fancy rocket ship here. So everyone loves upstream. This is launch, very sexy. It's a controlled explosion, tens of thousands of tons of rocket fuel. What people don't appreciate, man, I got to do a better rocket impersonation. What people don't appreciate about these rockets is they're 20 stories tall. You're launching a building into space, and some amazing technology happened in 2020. Not only can they launch these 20-story buildings into space, we can land them vertically. And so this is where people are all very excited about upstream. And so you see the most press about upstream because it's a big effing rocket. That's their official designation, and they're launching them into space. But more important than rockets to the future, to the space economy, and that's just one industry upstream, is space ports. And so if you're thinking Deep Space Nine, you're on the right page. And so you'll have space ports and research stations where you're doing research in space. And this is where George is going to answer your question about what business models can be supported in the space economy. Because George, what can you do on a space port or a space station? Go.
So what's nice about thinking ahead for a space station and the economies that will result around space stations is we already have mental models for this, right? These are industrial parks. We already have them here on Earth. So think about the types of businesses that you commonly see in industrial parks. Very similar types of businesses will take up space within a space station, all right? They'll be supported by industries in terrestrial spaceports. Right now, the FAA has 14 licensed spaceports. You do need a license to be a spaceport, much the same way that you do to be an airport. Those particular licenses, as I said, there's about 14 in the United States right now. There's plenty others that are in the chute. They will provide services for both launch and satellite manufacturing. But again, when we think about the future, we think about the in-stream, like Samson was talking about, and we think about space stations. Think about the economics of a space station, right? You already have stuff up there to produce goods. How high value of a good do you need to return? How high value of a refined product do you need to return to Earth to make this math work out? Even at $1,000 a kilogram, which is a very aspirational number, by the way. That's the rough cost of getting things up. Even at $1,000 a kilogram, it's a very short list of things that make sense to make in space and bring back down, right? But let's go through this list real quick, right? So the first thing is, well, maybe we're talking about stuff like Z-band, okay? So this is a very, very high-end fiber optic. Why might we need high-end fiber optics? Well, traders like fiber optics to be as good as possible between them and their exchange, so they can run their algorithms and make money off of your trades on Robinhood. Okay, so that's one. Two, think about the healthcare. Think about the biotech industry. Okay, that is a very high profit margin industry, and is also an industry that has a large amount of focus on research and development. Protein folding works better in low gravity. Not only does protein folding work better in low gravity, but the creation of artificial skin cells, which has been the majority of experiments, and artificial retina cells has already been proved out in space on the ISS. Let's extend that forward and think about the market right now. And again, as an economist, when I say market, I don't mean it the way it might sound, but think about the market right now for human organs. Okay, if you've ever had someone, I have, in your family who is on the transplant list, you'll know that the demand for organ transplants just in the United States is anywhere from 120 to 150,000 names, 150,000 souls deep. But yet every year, only about 30,000 organ transplants actually happen. So that means you have a very large amount of unmet demand. And this is unmet demand that ties directly to not only someone's standard of living, but and quality of life, but sometimes their life themselves. Okay, so if you think about the ability to print organs and to print tissues in space and that technology, this is going to mean that the industrial parks of the future, space stations, are going to have many biotech tenants. I'm not sure if it'll be Merck first or GlaxoSmithKline or Pfizer, but those names will all have either their own space stations or they will be leasing out space at one of these space station industrial parks. So that's the importance of that, and that's what I think the major ones to pay attention to are in the industry market.
I do want to clean up, fact check myself. When I was saying launch, I was saying space stations. I meant to say spaceports. And just to be clear, airplanes take off horizontally at airports. Rockets take off vertically at spaceports. And of course, ships land at ports. So the idea of a spaceport, it's not very new. If you've ever seen Cape Canaveral, that's a spaceport. So we all know what that is. And right now we have 14 different versions of Cape Canaveral. We just don't call it Cape Canaveral. So, and again, it's not just, you got to think about the space economy. There are the space ports that launch rockets and all the businesses around that support the spaceport, much like at the airport, all the businesses that support the maintenance of the airplane, the baggage handling, et cetera. And so when you get past, when you upstream is the first part of the space economy, once you get to upstream, you get in-stream. That's where you have satellites and space stations, as George was saying. He calls it low gravity. We also refer to it as microgravity. The secret of immortality, according to Dr. Gonzalez, is in microgravity. Because again, your cells, when they're in gravity, they're squished down. When they're free, or when they have less gravity and they're microgravity, they expand and they behave differently. And so this is why many people feel that the secret to immortality is in space. So part of it is we're always focused on the rockets, like, oh yeah, big, sexy. But the real brilliance of the space economy is the biomedical research, particularly when you combine the effects of microgravity with gene therapy, CRISPR, and 3D printing for organs. Then it's like, oh, there's someone alive today who's probably gonna live 200 to 300 years, because every 50 to 80 years, there's some new breakthrough in biotechnology that allows them to live another 50 or 80 years. So this is where, if you're thinking about the business of space, people think it's in rockets. These are the Uber drivers. It's really in the space stations. But that third part of the space economy where there's buku lot of money is downstream. And so data is the new gold. And the only thing that these satellites do in space is they push down data. That's it. And this data gets monetized. Me and George were having a great conversation recently about health data number one and space data number two. So George, what's the value of just data from space? If you can put a number to it.
So right now, the value of space data would be tied to both the security of the GPS network, the security of, and the networks that provide the majority of financial transactions. So even if you pegged it at 3 or 4% of global GDP, you're still talking about something that's worth several $1 trillion already, right? So this satellite data is also becoming even more important. I'm not sure this is where maybe someone asked a question about ESG later on, but when you think about environmental, social, and good governance investing, ESG, some people prefer UN SDG, ESG is the same thing. When you think about this type of investing, it's being done for a variety of reasons, for helping maintain a endangered species habitat, for reducing carbon emissions, for making sure that solar plants in far-flung areas of the world where it's cheaper to build them are actually online and producing electricity. Well, all of these ESG dollars that are flowing around, they're all going to get verified using space data. So if you think about the amount of commitments that have come out of Davos, that's where all good financial people go to die. If you think about all the information that's come out of Davos, around ESG investing, you can see that anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of managed funds will now have ESG as part of their investment policy statements, meaning that this tracking is even more important, meaning that the satellite data that allows for the tracking is even more important and more valuable. So just for ESG tracking and just for GPS, you're talking about trillions of dollars of data.
So we're going to pause for a moment and give Justin Cooper a moment to take himself off mute because he has his hand raised. And as he does that, just keep in mind the people who monetize data, 99% of them will never leave the ground. And so they're still part of the space economy, but all the analysts who are monetizing that data, they're not leaving Earth. Justin, did you have a question?
Yes. Hey, George, how are you doing? Actually, I had a question about the previous examples given for biomedical research and manufacturing. With the projected interest and obviously the benefits of a microgravity environment, but also taking into account, as you cited, the costs per kilogram of getting objects and materials, research materials and things to space, the obvious risks and the need for repeat and recurring flights for stocking and more equipment to load up on top of the cost of those space station environments. Would it not be more prudent, or is there interest in having biomedical research and manufacturing facilities on Earth that simulate a microgravity environment?
That's a good question. So the first part is when you look at the current options for simulated microgravity here on Earth, they require vacuums. And generating a vacuum is incredibly energy intense. And so therefore the costs are actually quite high to do that even here on Earth. There's been limited experimentation on things like the, I believe its technical name is the vomit comet. The vomit comet, which goes into a series of rolls. It's an airplane. It goes into a series of rolls and allows for microgravity to be simulated and experiments to be conducted. But put these costs, right? So the cost of maintaining a vacuum environment, the cost of renting space on the vomit comet, juxtapose the cost of a commercial space station. If you look at the costs of a commercial space station, either being proposed by Axiom, Redwire, NanoRacks, previously Bigelow, so you have more than one to look at. You can see that these commercial space stations to own and wholly operate are falling now under the $100 million mark. So that might sound like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money to a lot of people. But in terms of businesses, particularly biotech and pharmaceutical businesses, if you're talking about $100 million R&D spend, particularly if you're able to not just own it outright, but lease space, it actually becomes pretty affordable and a viable option. So yes, the numbers are very high. That actually relates back to the previous comment about asteroid mining, but we'll get to that. The numbers are very high, but the possible returns are clearly there. If you think about the amount of money that companies have made on things like Lipitor, Cialis, any of the wonderful ads that inundate us every time we try to sit down and watch some football, you quickly realize that each of these drugs is hundreds of millions of dollars of activity for a drug company. And so if they have a platform that enables them to do different research, better research their results in space, and their competition doesn't, that's a huge competitive advantage. It'll take one or two drugs, probably one drug from any of these platforms before the next board meeting that you sit on, because we'll say, you sit on Merck's advisory board, and you're at the board meeting and they go, hey, did you see what Pfizer did? They just got patent approval for that ABZ drug they developed in microgravity. And everyone's gonna look on the tail and be like, where's our space station? Where's our space station lease? That's how this is gonna progress, as I see it.
And I'd also like to add, when we're talking about research and development, the market for organ transplants just in America is somewhere between $40 and $50 billion a year. Because if you need a new pancreas, liver, kidneys, lungs, you're going to pay whatever it is the price the going is. And this is where the secrets of microgravity really are pushing the forefront of not only gene therapy, but just biomedical research as a whole. And two, because of the invention, because of the commercialization of nanosats, nanosats are much smaller than the traditional rockets that you see. It's a lot easier to get payloads into space. And this is where you'll see an uptick in just the amount of research across the board. And I do want to talk about, for all our Beltawallas out there, because someone made a reference to the expanse, we're going to talk a little bit about exploration, to boldly go where no woman has gone before. You see this played out a little bit. If you watch The Expanse, I know it's sci-fi, but bear with me because I feel like it's real. There's so many of the leads are female protagonists, from Ava Sarala to Naomi Nagata to Kamina Drummer to Bobby Draper. And so in space, the right stuff is being rewritten. You're going to see a lot more women in space, period, because the right stuff is being rewritten. Because before, you had to have a pilot, you had to have so many number of hours of training. But recently, Captain James T. Kirk, as well as Michael Strahan, went up to space as a tourist. So if you're somewhere between an ex-football player and a 90-year-old, you've probably got the right stuff to go into space. It's going to open up a lot of room, particularly for women in space. And so when we're talking about exploration in the space economy, why it's so important, this gets to asteroid mining. If we're talking about Site 16, it's got like 11 or 12 quintillion dollars worth of rare earth minerals in it. George will tell you what happens if they brought that rock back into orbit. George, what would happen if Site 16 came into orbit?
So first of all, the entire metals market would collapse, because there would be no longer any economic reason why you would extract a single metal from the earth anymore, because you have more supply of metals now in orbit, easily accessible, than you could ever harvest from the earth. It would, and more than likely someone would end up nuking somebody else. I mean, it would just disrupt all economic activity in the metals markets. And if you know anything about the size of the metals markets, if you count both their physical activity and their derivatives activity, is actually larger than the energy markets. So yeah, that's not a great thing. It would probably lead to a world war. Something else I want to make sure I mention too about the right stuff looking different. And I don't want to feel like I'm pandering to the audience here. There's also good mathematical reasons why the right stuff will look different. It makes almost no sense for you to send 120 kilogram Professor Pullen into space, because 120 kilograms is going to cost you way more, and you only get 3 merit badges for it, when you could send 2 or 3 individuals, all who are better trained than me up at that same kilogram rate. So, sorry guys, especially the 2XLs like me, you're not going to space anytime soon. It just doesn't make sense from a cost benefit analysis.
And so why that is true, because again, it's about how much weight you can put up, and also you got to feed the person. So as we're looking at exploration. It's not only to see what rocks are out there, what quote unquote rare earth minerals. Recently, we've had a debate whether or not there's some type of life on Venus. And so we're going to go find out at some point, because we're super curious, but this is super important. We may or may not find unobtainium. And it also presents the case of why you don't bring those minerals back to Earth, why there are factories in space on the moon where your limit, often if you've ever been to a space aircraft carrier, it feels like a couple city blocks. That's tiny compared to what you can build in microgravity, because the whole engineering and architecture requirements changes dramatically. And so this is why exploration is so keen. And that brings us to the fifth component of the space economy, and that's the role of religion. This came out of our class this past summer in Columbia, maybe it was a summer ago, where one of the students was like, religion is super important. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is so right. And so part of it, if you look at past eras of global expansion, God, gold, and glory. And so the church, there's always been a spiritual justification and authority behind the expansion of humans in the past. So if you really, really want to unlock your budgets, you're not going to go to Site 16. You're not going to colonize Mars. You're going to answer those bigger questions of, why are we here? Where did we come from? That's what unlocks the budgets. And so this is where, when you recognize that and you're building your technology, you don't tell me the pen, tell me about what it can write. Tell me the story that it's going to tell. So likewise, when you're thinking about the space economy, let's not lead off with, hey, satellites in space help us collect data for global warming, and will help us eventually come up with solutions to climate change. That's never going to get any funding. There's too much debate over that. But if you can add elements to your research of, we're going to figure out if we're alone in the universe, that's more interesting. That's where the role of religion in the space economy can't really be understated. I see some questions coming in, so I'm going to look at them before we talk about the plumbing of space, something called blockchain, which you may or may not have heard about before. Hold up, let me scroll up here and see some comments. Yes, we love Bobby Draper as well, Justin. Can you guys see my screen? I'm looking for your questions.
I was gonna say I'm scrolling down too. The first one, just to make sure it's answered sufficiently when it comes to asteroid mining. And this is something that's come up in our Columbia summer class pretty much every year. Does it make economic sense to go out and mine asteroids? 100%, it does. The problem is that in order for that to be a sustainable business, you need more zeros than you have or that we can raise capital for. So when you actually go through the business models and the way you would have to set up a complete supply chain to support said asteroid mining, it ends up reaching the billions of dollar mark. And although capital was basically free up until 2 months ago, there is still the issue with having to put together the $50 billion necessary to get one of these things off the ground and sustainable. So yes, asteroid mining will become a thing. Costs will continue to have to go down, and the infrastructure to support a supply chain that has asteroid mining as a piece of it has to be in place first. So asteroid mining will benefit from the pushing out of both Space Force and NASA, and they'll use that highway, that infrastructure for their activities. But space mining as a standalone, or asteroid mining, as a standalone business right now, does not pass the CBA test, the cost benefit analysis test.
I do want to address the maritime law question that's there in the chat. What role does that play? So recently in 2020, when I say we, the U.S. led by, I think we're up to 8 co-signatures on the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accord is an update to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. I think that's the right year, 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And so what that did was 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It established that a country can't own the moon, and some basic memorandums of understanding for mutual aid. Fast forward to 2020, the Artemis Accords were updated. The US signed, China and Russia were like, that's a cute piece of paper, we're good. And so they didn't sign. There are 7 other signatories. And so right now for space, we do have some guidelines, some thoughts where it's based upon maritime law, particularly for mutual aid. However, as China demonstrated when they put a asset on the dark side of the moon, right now the general guidelines is if you put an asset on the moon, you own everything within 100 miles of it. That's why the US is trying to go back to the moon in 2025. It's got pushed back a year. But China and Russia, they plan on developing a moon base in the next 2 years. It is a space race 2.0. So right now, maritime laws are a good way to think about it. What you will see as we have permanent human settlement, not only on Mars, not only on the moon, but the Mars, is where does property rights come in? And just to make it, because sometimes people are like, this is crazy talk. The International Space Station turned 20 or 22 years old in November of 2020. There's a lot of 20s in there. But the moral of that is we've had a human in space at the International Space Station every day for the last 2 decades. 0 fatalities. Space gets a little bit easier if you can put it on some ground. And so what that means for our basis on the moon, we're not inventing anything new. We're going to take the same technology that we've used to orbit the Earth in our space station, our International Space Station. We're just going to give it some solid ground to sit on. And so we will have space stations. There will be different types of space law that's developed. Lawyers, there are probably as many lawyers who are part of the space economy as there are engineers or astronauts. And most astronauts, there's a legal distinction. I'm going to ask George to tell you the legal distinction. Astronauts are the Uber drivers in the space economy because most of the vehicles, they're autonomous. George, what's the legal distinction between an astronaut and a space tourist?
An astronaut is recognized under international law and treaty. And so an astronaut, another country is obligated to render aid. So if you are a space tourist and not an astronaut, other countries are not obligated to render aid. That might seem like a small matter, but if you have a water landing and the closest boats to come and scoop you up are people that don't recognize you as an astronaut, it can become a big deal.
Yes, it can. There was another question about Biden's infrastructure bill helping the space economy, our space industry in general. I didn't read it, so I can't speak to that. I just wanted to acknowledge that question was there. George, if you have any insights you want to share, by all means, take a swing at it.
Let me see where the chat was. I'm trying to scroll through here.
I forget who asked that question. I saw it, but how does the president's infrastructure deal fit into the space economy? That was from Byron.
Oh, I have not read the infrastructure deal, but that's fine. I don't think I'm up to date either. I have not read the infrastructure deal, so I don't actually, so I don't know if there is any sort of tie back to the build out of space infrastructure. Something that I do know, however, is that the budget for budget requests for NOAA, NASA, and Space Force, these would be the 3 sisters of US government spend in space, have all gone up at a greater rate than the rest of the budget. So if we see increased budgets for NOAA, which is again, space both terrestrial and space weather observation, increase in budgets for NASA missions and for Space Force. All those have possible tiebacks to improved opportunities for space industrial firms. But in terms of the specifics of the infrastructure deal, I don't know what, if any, language in there about space in particular.
Just keep in mind as we talk about this infrastructure spending, as George mentioned, the Space Force budget this year was 15.4 billion or 15.2 billion. Space Force requested budget for next year is 17.2. So we're going to continue to see that that incremental increase in Space Force budget, as well as NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because from those satellites in space, that's where we get all the data for climate change. It's how we actually know the impact and whether or not we're changing it. So we can continue to see, as new green deals come up, we're going to see continued investment into the space economy. Just most people don't think that climate change has anything to do with space until we ask, where do you think those satellite imageries of the shrinking icebergs come from? So I do want to, oh, by the way, someone's offering some land for sale in the Sea of Tranquility. That's awesome. Christine probably wants to buy the NFT of that from you a little bit later. So let's talk about the plumbing of space, AKA blockchain. I'm gonna let George knock this softball out of the space first. Go for it, George. Put it in orbit.
Well, the very first thing to think about is when you have activities taking place off-world, you have a zone of activity on both space stations and on the moon. It is going to be taking place at a much higher expense, right? So let's think about a parallel. Let's think about who was one of the most sought after and in demand individuals in the last 20 years of our time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm going to do a quick pause for dramatic effect. HVAC specialists, okay? And this isn't going to be remarkably different when we are on space stations and on moon habitats, because HVAC is a critically important service out there. But also, when you think about the cost of labor in space, it goes up quite a bit. So it becomes something very similar to what we saw in both Iraq and Afghanistan, or on oil platforms, if you are familiar with that industry. People usually make 2, 3, even 4 times what they make in these environments than what they make in other places on Earth. I think we'll see something very similar in space, where people who are participating and providing labor services, space stations or on the moon, will also be compensated at rates that are 4, even 5 times that on Earth. When you're paid in space, you're not going to be paid in paper. Money is not going to survive the vacuum of space. It's just not going to work that way. And so your transactions will be done all on a digital ledger. It'll all be done on a blockchain. Now, whether that is done in Bitcoin or Doge or your favorite cryptocurrency, I make no guesses. But I will assure you that it'll be transacted only digitally. Samson has a wonderful concept that he sometimes explains about the tapper. I'll let him do that. I'm not going to steal that. But it explains very well how in something that is completely digitally native, there is no need for the current monetary and banking structures. That it wouldn't make sense. You're going to see a bank in orbit.
And part of the reasons you don't need a bank in orbit is paper just weighs too much. So it doesn't make sense to take, remember, you're paying by the kilo to put stuff in order. You're not taking paper. And so on the back of our book, it says no dollar can survive the vacuum of space. And it's basically because you don't actually want paper, number one. And number two, the most valuable commodity in space isn't currency, it's actually data. And data becomes currency, particularly if you have a couple $100 million worth of satellite equipment and you don't know there's a solar flare coming, or if there's a micrometeor shower headed your way. It doesn't matter how much money you have, you need to know that information. You need to know that bit of data. And so in the space economy, I tease people that in the future, only poor people will use money. Rich people will continue to use data as a medium of exchange. And so there's a question. Go on, George.
Oh, the other part of that too is if you look at parallels in the current aerospace industry, both Boeing and Honeywell are already using blockchain layers for the tracking of their goods, and the tracking of their parts. So they're using them as internal protocols. So this is more DLT than blockchain. I don't want to necessarily go into the nuance there, but it's not quite the same thing. But they're using this to connect their suppliers and better understand their supply chains. This is a very reasonable thing that we will also see for the space industry. We already see a number of startups proposing the use of either NFTs or blockchain transactions to secure payload space and load space for future space missions, including missions to the moon.
Mhm. And just remember, if you're thinking about having if you have a blockchain-based business, you take your satellites that are deployed around the globe and turn them into nodes. And now the question is, what do you want to do on them? It's actually not that complicated. So if you have a business that needs nodes, you have satellites in space, but what do you want to do? What is the purpose of your blockchain? Someone asked a question about robots earlier. You will have micropayments that go machine to machine, typically for maintenance, repositioning of if you're in this orbit, you need to come up to a higher orbit and you get pushed out. You'll have micropayments that are machine to machine payments that are paid out in tokens. There'll probably be time and space tokens, and we'll talk about that in a moment, as well as if George has gone off and gotten Mount Everest worth of gold or silver or nickel, someone will nuke him if he brings it to the Earth. So what does he do with all this? He commoditizes it, and he comes up with PEETs, which are periodic table of elements stablecoins. And those periodic table of elements stablecoins, they represent whatever exotic minerals are commodities that he has mined. And so those are one applications. There's a question about AccuBits. There's so many applications of this because, again, what are you going to do with your satellites you turned into a node? And for AccuBits, the question is encode global geological data on a private blockchain. That's downstream because all they're doing is taking that data from the satellite, pushing it downstream and monetizing it. So that's just one business application. And we did write an article, I'll share it with the group. It's called The Principles of Selling Time and Space. If you've ever been to an airport and you're standing in line, there's someone in a green vest and some khakis who's running late. And so the airport agent will say, hey, who's on the 8:30 flight to San Francisco? And that person raises their hand. They're way in the back of the line. What happens next is we execute a social contract where we all come to consensus. That person A, the agent, says who's late. The person with the green khaki vest raises their hand, and everyone moves and allows this person to skip everyone else. That's the basics of selling time and space. How humans execute that social contract is amazing. The question is, why can't you do that with ships who are going through a canal? Why can't you do that with rockets who are vying for optimal launch times? Why can't you do that for satellites who need to be in a specific order? In the past, we could never figure out how do you execute a social contract, but using blockchain and smart contracts, we will have the ability so that one satellite or a ship can execute a contract almost instantly so that the other vessel can sell them their time and space. And of course, you're going to wonder, well, how do you get time and space tokens in the space economy? Safety. Because if you're running a safe and sound operations, you have time, you have space, you're not in an emergency, you want to sell that time and space to some other person. Right now, those exchanges don't exist, but they are coming. Me and George were talking about how much is free data worth and what those data exchanges will be. Those data exchanges are also coming, and that will be blockchain based. And remember, in the space economy, the real money is not in launch, it's not in satellites, it's all downstream with data. So we have like 4 minutes left officially. I want to see if we have any questions, comments, last takeaways, parting shots, anything we said that was absolutely stupid or wrong. It's George's fault.
I'm waiting for a question to pop up in the chat or someone's going to go up, but until it does, I'd also want to point to another example of blockchain applications in space right now. Our friends over at SpaceChain, Z and Co. And so what they're doing right now is they're enabling a payment layer that interacts with nodes currently on 3 satellites that allow for the quicker payment of shipping and delivering in ports that have complicated and lengthy bill of lading services. If you're not into the shipping markets, that doesn't make sense to you, that's fine. Just understand that when goods and services come into many countries, they end up sitting and waiting up for payment for weeks, if not months, in some countries. And so SpaceChain has provided an operational layer on there. That's another great application for this, and they're doing it all on their own satellites, which is why it's so interconnected. There's other features as well with ring fencing and everything else, but we're not going to have time to get into that. Oh, I saw a hand. Michael, what's your question?
I'm just curious. You guys seem to have a really good handle on the various components of our topic. I'm curious if you identify opportunities, especially in blockchain. It's something I'm dive deep into, and I'm just curious. Do you follow value propositions of a variety of blockchains or sectors in the space economy?
I'm going to let George take that first. That's a good economist question. He's more like a witch doctor of numbers. Go, George.
Okay, I need a witch doctor then.
So first and foremost, if we'll start with the space economy, then we'll talk about blockchain. So if you're looking at businesses that are participating in the space economy right now, your choices are kind of about 4 flavors, right? So the first is any of the primes, right? So the primes are the cadre of household names that also support the vast majority of all DoD contracts. Okay, so this is Boeing, Lockheed, Airbus. Okay, so you have your primes, right? Raytheon. So a lot of people will invest in them as a proxy for space. I don't think that's an effective strategy. The reason I don't think that's an effective strategy, now this is investment advice, this is educational purpose only. The reason I don't think that's an effective strategy is because their portion of revenues coming from space is so small that you're really just picking up a lot of exposure to DoD budgets, which you're picking up exposure to. So that's one way. Your other way is there has been a ton of space SPACs. I had a long-going joke about how you couldn't spell space in 2021 without SPAC. SPAC. Anyway. So the reason that's the case, if you look at them, there's been about a dozen space SPACs. They're all now available on public markets. So, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, you can pull them down. Many of them have pulled back from their reverse IPO SPAC mergers. So potential value plays there if that's your can of worms. The third is something else that we're passionate about, which is regulated crowdfunding. And so there is a number of space companies that are startups that have done raises using Reg CF to get themselves into orbit, to get themselves into the space economy. These, of course, are smaller firms, so your risk reward proposition is very different, but they're being done on regulated portals, and so you can feel good that they're living up to certain standards of ethics and compliance and meeting with FINRA and SEC guidelines. And then last but not least is, of course, the most fun part of our day is when we're doing our show or doing our class or people end up picking up our book. They reach out to us directly, and so a lot of times the companies that we end up advising for or investing in are companies that are just getting into the space game, or even better, putting together a space vertical that would be a new entry point for them. So for example, there's a firm over in Germany. They had a developed specialty manufacturing for high performance race cars. And they realized this high performance manufacturing capabilities also lended them quite nicely to making parts for space applications. So that's an existing terrestrial business with a great business model that's adding space as a vertical. So I think those are the 4 gateways really for space. In terms of blockchain, if you look at the various space and blockchain projects out there. It's a fairly short list. You have Space Chain, you have Copernicus Space, you have Space DAO. All of these are various flavors of combining the two. I will not claim to have kicked the tires on any of those or endorse any of those, but those are all other opportunities right now where people are trying to combine space and blockchain for a given application. A lot of people are also using blockchain as a mechanism for funding of space. Of course, we know that that does not work here in the US, so that's not what's happening. But overseas, you've seen a number of companies do their raises that way as well. So I just throw that out there for people as well. Obviously, you could probably all know how I feel about ICOs, so let's not even get into that.
Michael, I'll also add as we wrap up, and we're a little 2 minutes over, check out Simba Chain, SIMBA chain. They have the most DoD and Navy contracts specifically for their decentralized ledger technology. They're based out of Indiana and are Notre Dame fans, so take that with a grain of salt. I went to Florida State, go Noles. The other one is Orbit's Edge. Orbit's Edge, they do edge computing in space. There's a shocker, there are no clouds in space, and not like actual clouds, but data centers, but there's no clouds and there's no clouds. So they're doing some really cool stuff. The other one is Neutron Star Systems. Neutron Star Systems, you can check them out. There's many businesses who are looking at using blockchain, not just on the DoD side, but also on the commercial side. So it's really, what's your business case? Are you going to be able to develop your product and go to market with it? I know we're a little bit over. Christine, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you have any things you need to say to wrap up. And also, George forgot to tell you that he's speaking in his personal capacity, not in his official job, but we're just going to wink and nod.
Yeah, that probably should have been a disclaimer I put out there a long time ago. But yeah, I'm only speaking today in my personal capacity and my academic. Nothing I said today reflects the U.S. government or any agency thereof. Thanks, there's the disclaimer.
Well, thanks so much for coming today, guys. I put some links, so if you want to follow Samson and George a little more, you can go to different websites. They have a podcast, their LinkedIn accounts. Our next episode in the series will be on Wednesday, the February 16th. I put a little bit of info about that too, about the Open Credentialing Initiative and how it helps to enable the supply chain, pharmaceutical supply chain.
Christine.
Yep.
Can I interrupt you? I forgot to say one thing that's super important. Ed is laughing at me. As we develop the technology for the space economy and space in general, we are not leaving spaceship Earth. We're not going to go terraform Mars. We're going to develop the technology here to terraform Mars. Then we're going to beta test it here, particularly carbon capture. We just opened up a plant in, not we, but Iceland opened up a plant called Orca that focuses on carbon capture. So the part of the reason we're most passionate about the space economy, we are developing the technology to preserve spaceship Earth. We're not leaving spaceship Earth. It's the only spaceship we've got. So I forgot to say that. So sorry, Christine, continue. My bad.
You are fine.
Maybe a quick question for you, Samson. Have you heard of the linear technology, LENR?
Mm-mm.
Okay, it's the new acronym for cold fusion. There's a guy, Andre Rossi, that's been in it for 20 years.
Okay. Yes, I know Andre Rossi. I'm familiar with his work.
Yeah, he's a man. He's a man.
Excellent. So sorry, Christine, we're about to have a nerd fest in a moment. I'm going to shut up and turn it back over to you.
Oh, you are fine. And does anybody else want to talk any longer, or do you guys want to? We could ask Rami if you guys can keep the channel open a little bit longer.
Sure. Yeah, that's not a problem at all.
You guys want to nerd out for whoever can stay online, or I'm not sure if Samson and George have.
Yeah, I have a few extra minutes, and I do want to repeat about development of 250 million years ago, when the dinosaurs looked up, they saw different constellations, because that's a galactic year, how long it takes the Earth to go around the Milky Way galaxy. So we are a starship. We have been traveling through the galaxy. In 250 more million years, we will be somewhere else. And so as we develop this technology, people think escapism, we're going to leave the planet and just like the poor people will stay on Earth and die horrible deaths. No, we won't. We will develop this amazing technology so that we can preserve our species as a whole. That's actually what gets me most excited about the space economy and the emerging technology that's coming out of it.
And not that I'm not a cold fusion fan, but one of the things that I'd point to with respect to the energy revolution, and I didn't mention this before, but the reason that we're so passionate about the space economy is because we see it as the fifth industrial revolution. Right. So currently we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We can assume that away. But if you think about what makes up the fourth industrial revolution, it has four parts, right? We have advancements in fintech, right? So a lot of times people will put blockchain in that category. We have advancements in energy, right? So that what sparked the thought on this, because Michael mentioned the cold fusion. We have advancements in biotech, and then we have advancements in machine learning and robotics, right? Those are your four stools. Those are your four parts of the fourth industrial revolution. All of those, as they're perfected and as they're used and then come into commercialization for the space economy, for the fifth industrial revolution, will have wonderful benefits on planet Earth, right? I mean, one of the things I like to talk about is SMRs. I know it's not as cool as cold fusion, but if you look at what Rolls-Royce and others have been doing with SMRs as small modular reactors, just so if we're all on the same nerd energy page. But if you look at what's been happening with SMRs, with small modular reactors, it's a game changer, right? So regardless of how you feel about nuclear waste, which we do have to figure out, although you can just blast into the sun, that's its own little thing. But regardless of how you feel about the nuclear waste involved after the 50-year life cycle of the plant, you have to realize that if we in this country, if just the United States, if we spent just $100 billion of infrastructure money, right? So, George, here's $100 billion. $100 billion in infrastructure money. We could build 100 nuclear power plants in the United States. We could bring the cost of electricity down to under a cent. Delivery cost only. Bring the cost of electricity, energy cost, not delivery cost, down to under a cent. The energy costs right now are going to continue to increase, because the grid in most places is 45 years old. The vast majority of our energy production in this country is 60 plus years old. This ain't gonna work, boys and girls. And so if you look at what's happening with SMRs, I think that's super exciting. And that technology has come out of countless advancements and countless technology transfers from NASA. So, but yeah, Rolls-Royce has a great one. Babcock and Wilcox has another one. And there's some other players in the space as well for SMRs.
Mm-hmm. Byron asked, what will we do about the population expansion? And so George is a witch doctor economist. I'm an anthropologist, so I deal with humans because humans are real. And so when we're talking about the population explosion, I'm going to ask you where at, because right now, if we look at the heavy population centers, they're predominantly on the continent of Africa, Lagos, Tanzania. Dar es Salaam, which is in Tanzania. And oh man, I forgot the other 8. I apologize. But right now, we've been such bad stewards of the Earth. The Earth is sort of figuring out a way to help sterilize us. We might do it all through 6G, whether or not that's a conspiracy theory. We're going to figure that out. But if you look at how we look at the effects of microplastics on our body, where we consume about a credit card's worth of plastics every week. Those are having some severe effects on our biology, and you can see birth rates declining, particularly in the quote unquote developed nations like America, Japan, South Korea, China. So I would be less concerned about a population expansion and more concerned about just how do we maintain fertility over the next 100 years.
Yeah, the population explosion, I don't think is a problem that people should be paying attention to, because too many people are already pontificating about it. It's the population decline. If you look at the way population has gone over long periods of time, it's as educational levels and as personal purchasing parity, so it's like GDP per person, but it's more complicated than that. That's the way to think about it, goes up, birth rates go down. And so the average educational attainment level across the world has increased by 3 grade levels just in my lifetime, less than 40 years. And so during that period of time, that increase has also resulted in dramatic decreases in birth rates. And so when we continue to see this, when we go from a situation today where approximately 85% of the Earth has at least a 6th grade education, to a future where we have more connectivity, right? So more satellites providing us with more information, more readily available in more places, and that provides more educational opportunities. You can reasonably see that the average educational attainment levels will go from, the 6th or 7th grade level, probably all the way up to a 10th grade level, right? Coming up to, average educational attainment levels through the Western world. If that happens worldwide, it's really interesting to think about, but important to also consider that we're going to be having this conversation in 40 years about declining birth rates, not about rising birth rates, not about overpopulation. And so I just would encourage you to have that as a contrarian thought and think about how that might work as part of your mental map.
And also, I see Ed had some comments about China. So one of the challenges with China, they did reverse their one-child policy. And now I think it's up there. They have incentives to subsidize having more kids. And so I think that one of the biggest challenges that China faces is they have around 40 million young men who can't start a family. They can't find a significant other or a spouse. And when you have about 40 million people between the ages of 18 and 35 with nothing to do and a slowing economy, that's just a brew pot for all manners of political unrest. And so that's something that not only China will have to tackle, but some other developing countries as well.
Add drought to that, and it's a recipe for disaster. Because that's essentially, sorry, but that's essentially what happened with the Arab Spring. You had a very, very similar situation, and you added drought.
I was going to say about the China thing, that's really interesting you brought that up, Samson, because I watched a video. There's this series of videos on, why, China is going to become the next superpower and why it's not. And the one reason it said it's not is its declining birth rate is so, it's not even that they have too many, the male to female ratio is off. It's about the declining birth rate, which official statistics are putting it out of, 1.5, out of every, whatever it is, 100 people born, I can't remember the official number, but it's actually much lower than that, to the point where they're being so underdeveloped, or their next generation is not being born at a fast enough rate. The birth rate, that's what it is. The birth rate is not fast enough to sustain their economy within, God, I think it was something like by 2040 or something like that. So they, in 2017 or it's like 2012, 2017, they went to a 2-child maximum, and now within 3 years, they went to a 3-child maximum. They're
yeah.
It'll be really interesting to see, because most developed nations' birth rate is above a 2, whatever on that scale. It's like about a 2 is what you need to maintain a sustainable economy, and they're like barely a 1.
Yeah. If it weren't for immigration into America, we'd be super screwed. We're just waiting. First off, it's the cost of childcare. It's cheaper for me to buy a Maserati, at least a Maserati or a Lamborghini, than it is for me to pay for daycare. And that's partially the cost of inflation, which we can all blame on George, by the way. He's solely responsible for inflation and stagnant wages. And so one of the other things I wanted to mention it's super important when we look at population, not population explosion, but we need to adjust our culture so it's less rat race and more family orientated. And I did want to put out as a disclaimer, because me and George love the space economy so we can make investments. And so more important even than the birth rate and the population, I'll let George talk about this. Don't tell them anything secret or that you're not supposed to say. Water, because we've been making investments in water because it's either a very profitable future or a very profitable and bleak future. And I'll let George tell you why.
So if you do a very quick map of freshwater resources, you quickly realize that the United States and Canada have large monopolies on available fresh water. And so what this means is, unless you have, again, cold fusion, so that desalination becomes affordable and cost effective for large populations, you start getting into scenarios where water rights, water and water assets become extremely valuable. And of course, we talk about water as an asset in space, and how the space station can reuse over 90% of the water that's on the space station. And that's all really interesting. But some of that tech's going to start being applied here in places where we have water scarcity issues. And the next time you're wondering what a water scarcity issue is, realize that it's not just poor forestry management, says the son of a lumberjack. It's not just for poor forestry management, but there's a reason that California is always burning. It's because they continue to plant higher and higher large emitting crops further and further south of Sacramento when all the water's north of there. So this is going to continue to be an issue, and it'll be an issue in many other states as well. Las Vegas is obviously another prime example of something that cannot exist without other people's water supplies. And so water rights, water obligations, and probably even markets that trade water are also going to be a big deal.
Yeah. So again, I know we're talking about population, but water is even more important than that. And I remember what I wanted to say about America. We're not for immigrants, we would be in a population decline. So if you go back to FDR and the New Deal, when the New Deal was instituted, we had 17 people contributing to Social Security for every one person drawing. Now it's basically 1-to-1. And the general consensus, and George, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that Social Security becomes insolvable, not bankrupt, but insolvable by it used to be 2034. Now, because of the pandemic and the extra strain on the healthcare system, it's now 2032 that Social Security will become insolvable. And that's a big deal for America. So when we're talking about who's going to be the next superpower, the next world power, we should be looking at, Tanzania, Nigeria, and India, particularly India, where we have some heavy bets in that India will be a dominant player in the space economy because they have the population, they have the brain power, and they have the culture of producing. They just produce a lot of smart people through their educational system who are primed to lead in the next generation. And so when I say the next generation, I mean the next couple hundred years. And so why this is important, because particularly with the pandemic, if you have a global digital marketplace for white collar workers, you also have to compete globally. So when Michael is 1 in a million on a planet of 7 billion people, you have 7,000 clones, 7,000 doppelgangers who are just as hungry as you to be successful. And so that really changes the dynamic of your place in this world and what it takes to be competitive in a global space. Any other random things? So we could talk about why The Expanse is the greatest sci-fi show out, or why Thanos is the most misunderstood character in the Marvel universe.
Oh, you use the word superhero like you normally do. Don't let him fool you. He calls Thanos a superhero on a regular basis.
Byron agrees with me. He is a superhero.
I would love to continue on the conversation. Unfortunately, I need to hop off and use my Zoom for something else coming up.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks,
no worries,
Michael.
guys.
I got the same, guys.
Thanks everyone who stayed on. And then yes, if you want to review this whole video, if you want to hear all the chat, everything like that, it'll be posted on our FIP Blockchain901 website. But thanks to Christine, thanks to Samson, thanks to George. Very
thank you.
conversation.
Yeah, so exciting. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. See y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
Orbit.